Extracting Value from a Coal Phaseout. Interview with Gireesh Shrimali, Episode 38. Welcome to the My Energy 2050 podcast, where we speak to the people building a clean energy system by 2050. I'm your host, Michael LaBelle. This week, we speak with Gireesh Shrimali, Precourt Scholar at the Sustainable Finance Initiative at Stanford University. He is also an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University and involved in the climate investment funds. As you'll hear, he has extensive experience understanding risk assessment from both a business and policy perspective. When we invite people onto the podcast, I get to know them first by reading their research and publications. So I can only map the topics we're likely to talk about. The conversation with Gireesh quickly expanded beyond his recent work with the World Bank and into areas like battery storage and new business models. It is a really fascinating discussion. One of the key takeaways from our conversation is the idea of value at risk and the interrelationship with transition risk. I find Gireesh's examination of risk essential for understanding how we accelerate an energy transition. We begin to discuss this about halfway through, and it is an essential concept for managers to understand when assessing the value of their asset portfolio. It is also important to understand how established technologies like solar and wind are already undermining coal and gas. We can view activist investors like those from Engine Number 1, which seated new members onto Exxon board as radical energy pioneers. But Gireesh and his analysis underlines the importance of risk assessment as the energy transition speeds up. You'll find our discussion worthwhile for understanding risk and how coal and gas are becoming stranded assets with companies unable to extract profits, thereby, actually this is really important, threatening the survivability of the companies themselves. They got to start changing. The intent of the My Energy 2050 podcast is to spread the knowledge about how the energy system can assist our transition towards a greener future. And just a short note, we launched our Patreon page this week. This is a soft launch, meaning like most things here, we learn by doing. So now you can assist the growth of our podcast by sharing our episodes or by going to Patreon and finding the My Energy 2050 podcast page. There's a link here in the show notes. And you can now donate money to help us produce a better podcast and highlight those making a difference in the energy transition. And finally, I just want to thank you for listening. It really does mean a lot that you are finding value in our work and hopefully learning more about the energy transition to assist in your own work. And now for this week's episode. I'm welcoming onto the My Energy 2050 podcast, Gireesh Shrimali, Precourt Scholar at the Sustainable Finance Initiative at Stanford University. Gireesh, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. I'm really excited to have you on, actually discuss your extensive research on the cost of coal phase-out. What captured my attention to you was the World Bank report looking at coal decommissioning in India. And so I'm hoping to get into that. But before we begin, I actually have this question I love asking people. And that's, how did you become interested in energy? You really write a lot publicly about energy and the transition and sustainable finance now. But what prompted your interest in this area?
And I'm glad you asked this because I used to be an engineer in the Silicon Valley, right? So I was designing computers and chips and very, very different from what I do now. And then I went back to do my PhD after working in the industry for a while, and I was looking for the next big thing, and in my journey I found I realized that the biggest problem that we face today is this whole issue of climate change. That's what led me towards climate change. And as I started looking at climate change more closely, I realized that given that the energy sector is in some ways responsible for a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, that was perhaps the the biggest thing we could go after and decarbonize the energy sector. So that's what led me into looking at the energy sector in terms of not only, and you brought up the whole thing around coal plant retirement, but what really initially got me interested was more green technologies. How do you deploy more green technologies? Um, and I've been working on renewables, and over time, from wind and solar, moved on to battery storage. Have also started looking at electric vehicles. But the basic idea is that how do you deploy more of these clean technologies, and how can you design policies and financial instruments? Um, and in that process, there is a recent realization that the world is coming to, is that if we want to get to the targets, the kind of targets that we are putting forward in terms of net zero by a certain year, mostly 2050, we have to not only deploy more green technologies, but also retire a lot more of the brown technologies, which include, obviously, coal is the in some ways the first target, but also gas, etc. And maybe going beyond that to other fossil fuels, like oil, etc. But the basic idea is, if we do not retire, or kind of in some sense do less of fossil fuels, even if we keep on doing a lot of green, we are unlikely to reach our targets. And part of the problem is, there's a lot of inertia in the system. Energy system is not as agile as maybe the information technology, and it's hard to change the status quo. And so that's why it's become interesting to me that we need to work on fossil fuel kind of phase out, and coal is obviously the biggest guy in town, at least, or the easiest guy in some ways.
So
I'll stop here. But
no. That's a great start, and gives me a lot of things to to get into. But I was wondering, just one of your last comments there. Could you compare your experience in working with in Silicon Valley before you became interested in energy, and you mentioned about the adaptability or the lack or the slow pace of it in the energy sector? Do you see maybe with the newer technologies a faster adaptability and fast things speeding up?
yeah, I mean, I think there is. I mean, and the reason there's, also depends on how you're comparing. If you're looking, I think largely the we built up this energy system over the last 100 years, whereas the technologies system has been a pretty new thing. So there's this also this kind of mindset that the technology sector is willing to change, but and the energy sector it's harder to change, partly because of just the mentality and the status quo or the inertia. But the other issue is, and how dependent are you on expensive infrastructure? And if you're like if you're really dependent on expensive infrastructure, those systems are harder to change. And that's why software is the easiest thing to change. I can code something overnight and just disseminate it to people, and my costs are pretty low. Whereas if I have to change the energy system, I'm just giving you a
Yeah.
kind of uh, you know, a very futuristic scenario. I mean, why do we even need power lines to transmit electricity, right? But right now I have the power lines and I have to deal with the power lines, or um, so I think there are a lot of interesting things that come into play. But I think, now coming to your real question about have things started to change, and there is hope with you know integration of technology into the energy system, right? I mean, what we call the ICT, information communications technology. I think there is obviously change can be faster. For example, this one clear example is using smart meters, right, at homes to kind of manage energy efficiency. Is a very good example that there is a marriage, right?
Yes.
In terms of, the Google Nest is another big example. Like, that's helping us save so much energy. And then on the other side, even managing energy systems in terms of resilience, and managing performance of energy systems, I think the ICT is starting to play a huge part. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
And that I'm just what brings to mind. You actually asked about do we need these electrical lines? But actually, I think it's a really apt question because at the present
Yeah.
moment there's blackouts in China, right? So they're not generating the electricity for the factories just to ensure that homes have the electricity. Now in the UK, I don't know, there's fuel shortages, right? In Texas, the power lines were frozen. In New Orleans, they built a brand new gas plant under the idea that they could still supply electricity even in a hurricane, and that didn't happen. So are we maybe at this point now where this built infrastructure that has, yeah, exactly, been built over the past century is just aging out and we can really go to a decentralized system?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is again kind of futuristic scenario, right? And I came from, as I said, the ICT world, right? And a very interesting example is the communications world, right? If you look at the old communications paradigm, it used to be AT&T, Bell Labs, large telephone companies, very centralized infrastructure, and the way that's how the phones work, right? They're very centralized. Whereas the whole thing was appended by computer networks, which is an extremely distributed system, and it took hold over time. And computer networks were not designed for speed or efficiency; they were designed for robustness and resiliency. So I think having the option to do decentralized generation and consumption is definitely very, very exciting, and it is a similar paradigm, and it not only gives you adequacy and it doesn't but it also gives you resilience, right? And you don't have these high power voltage lines going all over California and causing fires everywhere.
Which is totally true. It's a crazy story then, isn't it?
Yeah, and that kind of goes against. Obviously, California fires is a different issue, and I don't want to get in too much into that. But you kind of offset all the good work you're doing in California and mitigation, right? And because you're releasing so much gases because of fires.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's continue because one of the areas you've published on is about storage
Hmm.
technologies and developing the market for that. I was just wondering, why doesn't the and I'll just speak in general terms. I think the study focused on India,
Yeah.
or you can correct me, but why doesn't the market encourage at the moment? And this is a very broad question, but why doesn't the market encourage the use of energy storage technologies, maybe advanced systems, battery storage technology?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, to answer this question, if I may take some time.
Please.
Um. Um. See, the classically, and this has been the evolution of power markets, right? Classically, how energy was procured was under fixed power purchase agreements that specified how much a user or utility would buy from a power generation source at what price, and it was all fixed, right? And over time, we have moved towards markets where, in many cases, you have real time markets, you have day ahead markets, and you're kind of bidding into those systems to buy and sell energy. Um, Now, this is again an example of evolution, and that might have worked well for coal power generation, or even better gas power generation, because these systems have, and when we go to coal has half of its lifetime cost as capital expenditure, but the other half is operating expenditure. And gas, it's even, the balance is even more tilted in favor of the operating expenditure, so you could actually manage this in real time. But if you start moving towards renewable technologies, whether it's solar or wind or batteries, most of the cost is in capital expenditure upfront, right? And a lot depends on and kind of bringing the levelized cost of the average cost of these applications down. The cost of capital matters, right? And the cost of capital is most likely to be lower in power purchase agreements that are kind of fixed in nature, not market based solutions. So
Mm-hmm.
so one of the issues that we have dealt with over the last 10 12 years is it's kind of interesting. We're kind of going back to more fixed contracts, especially if you want to do more solar and wind, right? You don't want solar and wind to face the same cost of capital that perhaps a gas asset is facing, with the high cost of capital, because if you have higher capital expenditures, you suffer more if you have a higher cost of capital. Now, coming to and the same thing would apply to battery storage as well. Now, coming to battery storage itself, battery storage, and it's an interesting animal because it's not a hardware play in some sense. It's more of a software play, in the sense, it's plugging in the gaps. It's plugging in the gaps, and so when you plug in the gaps, you are very flexible. You can do multiple things. The idea is that you will be able to compete in multiple markets, right? Um, and you could compete in the energy market. You can compete in the ancillary services market. You can participate in a resiliency market, whatever. But when you have to participate in a market, it creates a lot of uncertainty for the investor, right? An investor is looking at and deploying this new technology, right? And they don't have a good sense of where the revenues are going to come from. And so it's hard to forecast revenues. And then on top of that, because of this uncertainty, the cost of capital goes up. And both of these, in some ways, go against battery storage investment. So what we are saying is that it's not that battery storage should not play in markets, but at the initial stages, when you're trying to deploy battery storage, you're trying to show proof of concept. Perhaps it's easier to think of having battery storage under fixed contracts, where you kind of give investors certainty, and kind of the utility basically, or the buyer basically then uses the battery storage for whatever they want to use it for, but give the private investor, the certainty. And as the markets mature, maybe then you can let it go back to market. So that was the whole argument.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you mentioned about filling in the gaps. The battery storage could fill in the gaps. What kind of gaps are there that it could help with?
I mean, the easiest one is, as I mentioned, right? I mean, it's the energy, right? I mean, for people who don't follow this, for example, if you look at California and many other places, we are starting to see this because of very high penetration of solar. We have something called the duck curve.
Uh-huh. Yes.
And the duck curve has to do with, duck curve has to do with, you're looking at the net demand, which is demand minus supply, right? And if you look at systems that are heavy with solar, suddenly solar disappears around 4 or 5 in the evening, and you had the net demand being very low when the solar was there, because solar was able to supply all of that. So suddenly solar disappears, and the net demand just blows up, and puts a lot of stress on the system, because now at that time, suddenly, if we have like this steep kind of increase in the net demand, which has to be actually fulfilled by something else. And it could be, again, coal plants are not suitable for doing these fast ramp ups. So either you go to natural gas, or you go to battery storage. And so that's one example. But I could talk about other examples where, when you're trying to do load following, or you want to do frequency regulations, which are like shorter time scales, battery storage is a much faster response than anything else you can think of, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we are. And but the on the flip side, just to finish the story, is the battery storage is still there for kind of, I would say, seconds or minutes to a few hours kind of duration of what you call system flexibility services, which is essentially, in my mind, just an imbalance, supply demand imbalance. But battery storage is not cost competitive beyond 4 hours or so.
Uh-huh. But it's those seconds and minutes, right, where they could really make some money then in regulating the system.
Yes, they can, but the thing is, let's pick the example of frequency regulation. And actually, you had asked me this question about whether we have done work mostly on India, but we just recently are coming out with some case studies on California and Hawaii on looking at business models, and in that process, we also ended up looking at the PJM market,
Mm-hmm.
and the thing is. The thing is, battery storage can help with frequency regulation. Frequency regulation is one of these services where short term mismatches can cause the frequencies to drift.
Which
And
and
storage
you
can
have to
come
keep
in.
it stable in the system.
Exactly,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. And the thing is, but that and the PJM market is an interesting example that of this frequency regulation. But the issue there was that the market is very shallow, and you have to also look at how big is the market. Is it a multi-million dollar market, or hundreds of millions of dollars of market, or multi-billion dollar market? And most of the market for energy storage is going to be in energy arbitrage, what we call it, moving energy around. Frequency regulation, the market is pretty shallow, even though the profits are high. So
Okay.
again, you have to look at different applications, and the PJM. What happened was there was a market being created, and then they changed some regulation. The market collapsed.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. And so the investors that were there lost money then, or
They lost. I mean, retroactively, they started losing money, and that kind of shut down the market. So that's an example of, like, if you're doing uh, creating regulation around markets, at least be consistent.
okay. And then now you say you're coming out with these studies on the business models as well. Are the business models shifting, or are they still heavily reliant on, we could say, regulation that accepts or rejects certain business models into connecting to the grid, or maybe it's homeowners?
No, I mean, we looked at all of these business models. We looked at what you call the front of the meter, behind the meter, and the combination of two. Because that's the other thing about battery storage, is that even if it's behind the meter, it could be aggregated and used for front of the meter applications when it's not being used for for at home or the commercial real estate.
So
Um,
wait, behind the meter is it's connected to the grid. Is that right?
Behind the meter is also connected to the grid, but it's at home, so it's behind the meter, right? Like, just think of a Tesla Powerwall, right?
Okay.
That's behind the meter, right? It's sitting at home, whereas ahead of the meter is like you've gone ahead and you kind of start to participate in the distribution grid, or you start to participate even in the transmission grid services, right?
Uh huh.
So there needs to be some kind of aggregator that kind of starting to manage all that. Yeah, but the point I was trying to bring forward, whether it's California or Hawaii, but these are the two states we looked at, and then obviously we ended up looking at PJM, is both of these states are kind of trying to provide some security to the investors to get the investments in. And even what the paper we did recently for India on saying, hey, you have to create a policy and you have to give certainty, was pretty much based on our work in Hawaii. If you look at the Hawaii contract, it's called renewable dispatchable generation, which is what it says is that let's commit to having paying to the battery installer on a fixed power purchase agreement, and the buyer of that and the kind of the buyer side of the contract has then control over that battery, and they can do what they need to do to manage the system.
Okay. And that gives them greater flexibility then, doesn't it? With turning on, turning off, the things that
Yeah,
it can
it,
do.
it just gives them control.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned the duck curve, and the duck curve essentially because there's so much solar coming online and installed in homes or well everywhere,
Yeah.
that the power from say coal-fired powered plants are not needed during the day, but then in the evening you have this problem because the sun goes away, and then they got
Yeah.
to ramp up, which is harder to do coal or nuclear at shorter notice.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And are there solutions to this? Is it just battery storage technology? Is a long-term solution connecting solar and batteries, or are there some other technologies that might be more acceptable over the longer term?
I think batteries is the main one. I mean, in absence of batteries, it's most likely to be natural gas, right? Um, um, uh, and batteries is considered to be. I mean, again, when I say batteries, I mean storage, right? Um, so I think there are different kind of batteries that are being used for different kind of applications. But batteries is, in my mind, it's, and perhaps I'm jumping ahead. If I envisage a power system in 2050, right? Um, my sense is, and it's a like power system. Is essentially you have a lot of wind and solar, right? And this is the power system that's close to 100% green, and then it has batteries to do the the minutes to a few hours kind of system balancing. And then as you start going towards longer term storage, then again, you can think about longer term storage batteries like flow batteries. But if you start going into days and months kind of storage, then the next big kind of hope is green hydrogen
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that we haven't talked much about, right? So that's what looks like a complete system to me, right? Now there are potentially, in my mind, potential still plays for carbon captures and sequestration, which is CCS, or nuclear power. But if the momentum that I've seen so far behind wind and solar, if that tells me anything, this renewables plus battery storage plus green hydrogen is likely to be it, unless there are some significant roadblocks in kind of battery storage is already here, unless there are significant roadblocks in developing green hydrogen, which I don't think is
Oh.
likely to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We'll move on to the hydrogen. I wanted to kind of focus on the risks again, but you also have done research and you explained the value at risk and the interrelationship with transition risk. Can you describe that a bit more? And I actually have their Medium article in front of me. I think maybe these are two separate things, but can you explain what value at risk is?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think we're shifting gears a little bit. So okay, just to maybe I
Sorry,
have to.
I like that's like surprise. So my
Yeah, that's a
apologies.
surprise for the listeners, right? But happy to go into this. So this is again a little bit of kind of um, maybe sharing some basic concepts first before we go to value at risk, right?
Hmm.
So and shifting gears a little bit, we are looking at climate change as a potentially a financial risk, right? To financial risk to assets on ground or companies or even countries. Okay, and the idea is that, and just to take an example, so just to kind of clarify, because that example will help us understand what I mean by value at risk when I talk about it. So let's say I'm a coal power plant, or I'm a coal power an independent power producer who has predominantly coal power plants, right? So the whole business model is structured around, I'm going to build this coal power plant. I'm going to make an investment, and I'm going to recover my investment. And just to simplify the matter for now, I'm going to recover my investment through a merchant power market like Texas. I'll be selling my coal power into Texas because I have a forecast on um, how much power or energy demand that Texas would have, right?
Hmm.
Independent of how much um, how much demand or how much pressure Texas would create on how much renewable energy they want to have in the system, right?
Okay. Okay.
Because that's the kind of the competing factor, right? Because if my projections for my coal power generation are based on the premise that Texas will have, I'm again throwing out a number, just 10% of their power from renewable energy. And that's my business as usual scenario,
Yes.
right? Um, and then it turns out that because of a policy, right, which is Texas says tomorrow that they have signed up for the net zero target, and they say they're gonna just go completely renewable, or so that's a purely policy driven thing. But it could also be cost driven, right? I mean, if Texas figures out, or it's that they're letting it's in market, anybody can compete in the market. So now it turns out that where coal power was bidding into the market, now solar and batteries can bid in much cheaper, and they get they get to sell energy at a cheaper price. So the point I'm trying to make is that what I'm talking about in broad term is something called transition risk. The system is transitioning, right? The system is transitioning because of many different ways. Because policy might change, the costs might change, and all that is happening. So what happens is that if the system transitions from your business as usual scenario where you've done your financial modeling and you say, hey, I'm going to make this much money, which is in some sense called value creation, right? You value essentially means how much money I'm going to make in today's term, which is the net present value concept, right? If I go under a transition where I have a high renewable scenario, so-called high renewable scenario, the my value today could go significantly down because of that transitional scenario that I perhaps didn't model for. So the difference between my estimate of value in a business as usual scenario, which perhaps had high coal, so I have that number X, and then I have another number Y under a high renewable scenario called Y. The difference between X and Y is the value at risk. So a lot of the analysis that people are doing today is figuring out under these so-called transition scenarios, what is the value at risk for especially fossil fuel heavy assets and industries and business models, right?
Yes.
So that's the concept, and I kind of took a detour and explained this in longer because I thought perhaps that was useful, but happy to answer any follow-up questions on that.
Yeah. No. It was an excellent explanation, and I'm going to ask you questions that you may not have the answers to. I think those are the best kind of questions to ask.
Okay.
And this value at risk, I mean, could this be used as a way to phase out faster fossil fuel plants or just anything? Because if we can kind of assess how many years it would take to phase out certain coal-fired power plants, and you do this well in the study on India, then we could put a value on that and phase these power plants out at a faster pace while maybe paying to have them decommissioned. Does that make sense? Or is that possible?
Yeah. Well, the value at risk, and I'm going to steer this conversation towards a little bit towards how do we take care of the coal plants. The value at risk concept could be used. The primary use of the value at risk concept would be to say, hey, think about if you're a fossil fuel heavy entity or a generator, think about changing your portfolio towards a more greener portfolio, and so it's basically called scenario analysis, right? In business, right? Um, um, but now coming to maybe a slightly different aspect, which is what if I already have these coal assets?
Yes.
And what do we do about those coal assets? And that kind of leads into are there ways to kind of you know perhaps in a transition scenario that has high renewables or high kind of the net zero kind of scenarios, we might have to even start retiring some of these existing coal plants. And how do you do it in an effective way? That again gets into slightly different kind of analysis, and you can connect it to value in some slightly different sense. And I may define value slightly differently there, right? And the value, the way I will define differently is that, and if I may take a few minutes, is to say, if I'm thinking of retiring an existing coal plant early, how do we do that, right? And obviously there are many ways that have been suggested, which simplest is that you refinance the existing coal plant at a much cheaper rate of capital, and a lot of multilateral banks and think tanks are coming up with different ideas. One is called securitization, which can retire contracted assets in a faster way. Another is you create a new fund that kind of buys off existing coal plants and retires them early because they have access to concessional capital, right? But connecting back to your kind of a question around value, let's define value a slightly different way. If we could somehow take these existing coal plants, right, and just not retire them, but think of what kind of benefits we could gain from retiring the coal plants and fossil fuel plants and repurposing them with um, perhaps renewable energy plants or renewable energy plus battery storage or something like that. So just go from brown to green as opposed to saying, "Oh, I'm not going to do brown." You know, you're going to do more green stuff. And so this that allows you to kind of look at, okay, if I'm decommissioning or retiring a coal plant, maybe there's some costs associated with that. But if I could use the same land and you can use the same infrastructure, maybe I can, get some benefit out of that, and that maybe helps me reduce the cost of um, installing more renewable energy or more green infrastructure. And so in a way, I could look at the cost benefit analysis. It's more classic cost benefit analysis where I'm kind of creating value by going directly from a coal plant to a renewable plant by kind of looking at cost benefit and not just cost. So I'll be kind of moving more towards the repurposing work that I've done. But I just want to kind of differentiate, right? Because there's one is value at risk, which we do in financial sector, and now we're kind of
Okay.
talking about on ground kind of more real work,
The
right?
value. Okay, so let's stay on the ground first, and then we'll go back to the value at risk and essentially portfolio management. And the value on the ground. So maybe the way to look at it is, right, the location. There's existing power lines, the existing infrastructure, not just the coal plant itself. Is that right?
Yeah. So if you look at the benefits that you get by this so-called repurposing, right? Which we take a coal plant that you retire and decommission, right? But then you repurpose to deploy maybe solar and battery storage, and what you want to make sure is that, and what it also allows you, and I'll talk a little bit about it. But the benefits are manifold, right? Benefits are I mean, I could sell the metal, right? That it's called the scrap value, and use that towards what I'm going to do. Invest in the new technology. I got some extra money. I could use the land, obviously, land, and especially in developing countries or countries that have restrictions on how they can obtain land. That would be a big benefit. But in addition, these coal power plants already have access to the transmission infrastructure. I mean, in many countries, just getting access to this infrastructure is not easy. So you can do a lot of the stuff. And you can get pretty creative. You can also start using not only the land or the transmission and distribution, kind of the infrastructure of the transformers and the connections to the grid. You can start repurposing some of the existing um, parts of the coal plant, and for example, the turbo generators in a coal plant can be repurposed to be a synchronous condenser, and start providing some reactive power to the grid. It's now we're getting very technical, It's perhaps going even beyond my expertise, but those are the options, right? And then even beyond that, you are starting to perhaps and you're starting to address in this process a lot of the pushback against coal plant retirement, which has to do with the just transition, right?
Yes.
What happens to the communities? um, so obviously you're not completely solving the problem because a renewable energy plant might need fewer people than a coal energy plant, but you can start employing some of the people that might get laid off, the communities that are kind of dependent on this, and they may be brought back in. A lot of time, the pushback comes from local taxes getting disappeared, and so if you're kind of deploying a new plant in the place of an existing plant, you know you can start getting local taxes is not an issue, and obviously then you start, and these are perhaps as I'm talking about this, we're going from more direct benefits to more intangible benefits,
Yes.
and then you can start talking about intangible benefits, but still many kind of in between benefits are like water, right? I mean, coal plants use a lot of water, and a renewable energy plant may not use much water. So it helps the community in kind of conserving water. Health benefits, right? I mean, communities living close to coal plants, they have a lot of health problems. That's hopefully starts going away, and then you can go even farther out and start talking about carbon dioxide, right, and greenhouse gases. So I mean, that was the whole idea of the World Bank paper, and I'm just kind of going back to that, right? Is to kind of show that there's so many benefits, and if you can kind of account for that, that helps you make a better case in a net benefit, from a net benefit perspective, to kind of show that there is economic value, but it also helps you kind of address a lot of the pushback that you get against coal mine closure or coal plant retirement. But I'll stop here. Hopefully that was useful.
No, it's really useful, and I think it goes to one of my, actually maybe my secondary question I had from that study was, what are the benefits that can be accrued by, I would say, what is there? There's a controlled explosion and uncontrolled explosion. And in this sense, there's a controlled phase out where you consider all these factors. Like if an investor, right, because they want to maximize their investment and their money. So they want to think about, what to do with the turbines, for example, or what do we do with the site? What part is good for residential or industrial development, and all these things. And if we're thinking about a phase out, and I think it's very realistic and actually much more tangible to talk about a coal facility itself and all the benefits, direct benefits and indirect benefits that can gotten from that by doing a controlled phase out, basically, does I'm trying to find a question. These are my statements. So
Yeah.
But it makes sense then to be much more in control from a policy perspective in phasing out these coal-fired power plant sites so that the value can be maximized for each site.
Yeah, and I think that's why. And I mean, the question could be. I mean, one of the question could be. I mean, this doesn't have to be like overnight, right? If you can, if you can align the incentives, right? I mean, if you're a private guy whose incentive was to maximize generation from a coal plant, then that person would keep on generating as much coal power as possible and pollute and all that stuff. But now, if I change ownership, and this is what has been proposed to the World Economic Forum, and I've heard many multilaterals talk about it, including Asian Development Bank, where the idea is to create a fund that takes over existing coal plants with a different ownership structure, and where the owners are hopefully better aligned towards kind of phasing out that plant and minimizing generation. Obviously they have to make sure that they have to get their returns on this investment, but by using concessional terms, you could, and this is something I've started to think about, if you bring in concessional capital, um, some preliminary analysis that I did was, is that for every percentage point a reduction in the cost of capital, maybe I can retire the coal plant a year or two earlier. Just because my return expectations are lower, I don't have to operate the coal plant much longer. Or now that I'm very aligned on with the environmental angle, I say if I retire early, I could perhaps claim carbon credits and use those carbon credits to retire it even further earlier, right? So it doesn't mean that you do it like overnight. You could do it in a more controlled manner, but it's about, in the political economy terms, aligning the incentives properly.
Right. So it's about changing the owner's incentives so that they're incentivized to maximize the value, but not just from power generation.
Yeah, it's a societal value.
A societal value, right? And then obviously we could put the environmental or even carbon pricing. These types of things could be part of the equation. Then, so then that brings us back to because I really like the idea of value at risk. And you bring on it, you touched on it just now again, I think. And this is almost the scenario where Exxon, for example, had activist shareholders taking over the company with the idea that Exxon or other oil companies need to do more to phase away or to transition away from oil and gas. Is this the area where this value at risk, their existing reserves are seen as a risky asset now, and that they need to invest their money in other assets?
Yeah, I mean, so the value at risk, the whole concept is that look, when businesses make decisions, they, I mean, one of the methods is that they're working on expectations, right? Um, and when you work on expectations, you try to create scenarios and assign probabilities to those scenarios, and then you say, I'll try to do an expectation. And something like that can be done for climate, but it's harder. So what you get into doing is, because assigning those probabilities to those scenarios has proven really hard, because a lot of that is endogenous to the system. It's not exogenous to the system. But so one thing that people have been doing is doing scenario analysis, where you want to say, what is my best case, what's my worst case, and I want to make sure that I'm getting ready for the worst case outcomes, right? And at least, even if I'm not completely changing my behavior today, I'm creating an option value for myself in case some of these scenarios start playing out, right? And so the whole idea is that, and this is something we're thinking about from an academic perspective, is that how do you, if not completely changing your behavior today, how do you start creating real options for yourself where you are able to switch quickly or in a short period of time, and you're not taken by surprise? And it's a hard question, because if you're infrastructure heavy company, those transitions don't come quickly. But I'll just end with an example, right? When we did our analysis, and that was the specific analysis on the coal dependent companies in India, we looked at key players, right? We looked at the largest coal power producer in India, NTPC. We looked at the Coal India Limited, which is the largest coal mine owner and coal producer. And then we looked at Indian Railways, which kind of, a lot of whose revenue depends on just transporting coal. And we are saying, look, you have a lot of value at risk. We quantified, like, about $10 billion of value at risk in the next 10 years. And all we are saying is, look, that's just the first step. Assessing that risk is just the first step. But how would you manage it? So let's start thinking about management of that risk by starting to diversify options, starting to create, maybe real options for yourself. And some of the stuff is already starting to play out, right? What we suggested, that the NTPC, and this is fairly obvious stuff if you look in retrospect, right? Instead of doing just be aggressive on coal, get more aggressive on solar.
Mm-hmm.
And easier for NTPC because they're a power producer. They could just tomorrow say, we won't do any more coal, go to solar. Harder for Coal India, right? Which the whole model is around coal, right?
Well, that's the name.
But yeah, that's cool. But and actually, NTPC is also National Thermal Power Corporation, right? That's thermal,
Uh-huh.
but I think there is hope, right? I mean, and it's not going to happen overnight. But if you buy into, I mean, you could be completely blind to the transition and say, I'm just going to do what I want to do, or you start diversifying, where you say, yeah, I mean, I'm and in Coal India also, and this is something we didn't write much about, but you could potentially look into, if you're a mining expert, you get into, okay, what does the green transition bring me? And the green transition perhaps is going towards battery storage, and I'm a mining expert, I'll get into mining of rare earth metals, and so start shifting my resources towards that. Or I start investing, in more maybe if I have access to not coal power, but like if I have access to gas, I start thinking about blue hydrogen, if not green hydrogen. So there are ways, and this is some of the work we're starting to do at Stanford here, right? We're starting to look at all these petroleum majors are starting to look at blue hydrogen as a potential way to manage the transition. So there are different ways that you could manage it.
Mm-hmm. And in one sense, I don't want to characterize our conversation, but we've spoken about policies and creating transition and maybe forcing companies to change. But the cost of technology itself, like solar, can actually drive and make these companies more exposed to risk.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what I meant by, transition risk is just not policy, right? It's the cost.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Of other
And
technologies, the
yeah,
competitive
exactly.
technology.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
And then that's the case. What in India now, even in the United States, the cost of solar is below that of coal. Is that, am I
It's
correct on that?
everywhere. It's
Yeah, everywhere.
in many jurisdictions. I mean, my some of my India work was motivated by some of the work I saw happening here in the US, where some of my colleagues were working on contracted coal assets in many of the states in the US, where and that's where perhaps we end our conversation. But what we started to see was that the and this is the interesting fact that people miss out on, and that's why I keep on stressing on it. The In many cases, in many jurisdictions, the levelized cost, which is the average cost of power from a renewable source, right, is cheaper than the variable cost of power from a coal plant, right? So if we are talking economics, right, and I'm here now and I look forward, I'm better off buying power from a new renewable energy plant as opposed to an existing coal power plant. Right? And that's where the whole rationale comes in for shutting that coal power plant down, because I can actually might as well go for a new renewable energy plant. So that's what has started to change the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Great, Gireesh. Okay, we'll keep it there. We'll just. I like ending the conversation on it's definitely cheaper to go with solar rather than coal. I think that's the
And wind,
and
is
wind and
also
wind
very
as
safe.
well, right? And then we didn't get into green hydrogen, but let's leave it
Yeah.
for that. Which
And now just to well, if I may have a final comment,
yeah.
is battery storage is becoming so cheap that now renewables plus storage is getting cheaper than coal. I don't think it's new. I don't think it's existing coal yet, but it will get there. But definitely new coal, and that's where the whole conversation started. Even with wind and solar, first it was compared to new coal. Then we got into this thing with the cost reduction that it's actually cheaper than old coal. And battery storage and renewables are going to get into that. It's the downward trend for a lot of these technologies. So, yeah.
So the
Anyways.
energy transition. I don't want to say we don't need policy. The policy is super important, but actually even just the market price itself will drive this transition as well?
Well, the policy has to create the market. That's where the thing is. So the market has to be created by the policy to bring in the initial deployment.
Yes.
And the classical learning by doing and getting it to scale. And once it gets to scale, then you can let the markets take over. But the issue is that you have to create those markets through policy, through regulation, through subsidies, especially in the early stages of the technology when the green technologies are more expensive. So.
Excellent. All right, Gireesh, thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this episode. We produced the My Energy 2050 podcast to learn about cutting-edge research and the people building our clean energy system. If you enjoyed this episode or any episode, please share it. The more we spread our message of the ease of an energy transition, the faster we can make it. You can follow us on LinkedIn, where we are the most active on the My Energy 2050 webpage, or on Twitter and Facebook. I'm your host, Michael LaBelle. Thank you for listening to this week's episode.